and we're having a conversation with Reverend Dr. Dwight Webster of Justice and Beyond, as well as the Senior Pastor of Christian Unity Church. We want to talk this morning about the work that you, as well as Justice and Beyond, have taken up as it relates to the disadvantaged business enterprise programs that exist in so many agencies throughout this community. The first question I'd like to ask is simply, why has this been such a significant, important issue for you as a community leader and the organizations that you belong to?
Thanks. First, let me thank you for the opportunity to share with you and those who will view this and interact with this piece, and for Beverly McKenna and the Tribune, and just all these institutions of the community without which we really wouldn't be where we are today. Let me give just a little bit of context. Pat Bryan approached me, who is a longtime community organizer and a foot soldier. Well, he's both a foot soldier and an officer in community organizing, and made me aware that Justice Burnett Johnson was in the throes of being denied what was rightfully hers in the ascension to the Chief Justice position in the state Supreme Court. A number of other organizations and opportunities had taken place where community awareness was raised all across the state, and so it fell to us in New Orleans and Orleans Parish to do our part. And as we began to meet, we didn't want to form an organization. All of us are involved in organizations, and just one more organization would have been too much. So we fell upon the notion of a coalition, a community coalition. And no one has to surrender any identity or anything. You just show up at the table. And so the original name was Justice for Justice Johnson. And then we found out the students at Cohen, Carver, students across the river, Old Perry Walker, Landry, there were issues that were being raised across the city. So before we knew it, we were connected with educational issues. So this became now Justice for Justice Johnson and Beyond. At the same time, we were interacting with the school board, its leadership, and various and sundry other issues began to arise. So the Beyond piece was very important. And as we were planning our major rally at Christian Unity, the 7 justices, 3 of whom were added to those who were recused, decided, well, you know, after all, Justice Johnson does deserve her justice. And we want to make it clear, they said, that this has nothing to do with community pressure. We all got a good laugh out of that. Then we asked ourselves, what do we do? We had issues that were coming up around the taxi cab drivers and injustice, the students, the United Students, Ashana Begard, and Coach Skip Lamont, and so many others across the city and both sides of the river were raising issues. So we said, well, we got the justice for Justice Johnson, and we decided also that the 2 rally issues that we could all join together on were justice and righteousness. So with the righteousness piece, we knew that might be off-putting for some people, but we knew it was clear that we could say justice. So Justice and Beyond became the shorthand. What we also saw with the students were parts of families. In those families, parents weren't working. Many of the parents that weren't working had some skills, and we were finding out that they couldn't work because they weren't getting hired by contractors. And some of those who were what we call disadvantaged business enterprise contractors, and certainly the majority of them were not being hired by the majority culture contractors. So we began to see that this thing was organic and connected. And we then also noticed that we were not doing what other communities like Atlanta had done to make sure that there was a fair and equitable distribution of wealth and opportunities. So disadvantaged business enterprise became one of those things upon which we hung our hat. Now I know that's a pretty long response to the initial question, but let me just stop and see if we can regroup.
Oh, no. I think that kind of addresses it well. what have been the major issues that you've seen in terms of the way agencies and governmental agencies in this city have dropped the ball as it relates to DBEs?
Yeah, let me just give this as, and I don't mean to be flippant, but teeth. That's the metaphor that I'm coming up with. If there is a DBE, if there is a disadvantaged business enterprise policy, if there's an office, if there's anything, question is what teeth does it have? The notion of compliance, where you can say and what you can say about your good faith efforts. We're finding that the city has, well, let me start with the school board. Because we have this collapse of school board issues, RSD into OPSB, Orleans Parish School Board, Recovery School District, we find that at first there was not, RSD has no DBE policy, and because they're state run, the state doesn't have one. One of the things Governor Bobby Jindal did when he got in was to abolish any of those things. And so they said, well, we're not obligated to do that. To OPSB's credit, Orleans Parish School Board, they did establish a disadvantaged business enterprise policy. But we feel at Justice and Beyond, it's been subverted and undermined and maybe even sabotaged by the interim superintendent, Stan Smith, who has not allowed the DBE person to sit in on contract deliberations, deliberately kept out the whole notion of compliance. And what do you do if you have a contract with a contractor, a general contractor, and you say you have DBE expectations and they don't meet them, they don't even entertain them? When do you do something about that? We only see one instance where Stan Smith did anything about that lack of compliance. So from Justice and Beyond, we've been putting pressure on the school board, on its staff, raising awareness in the community. But even with OPSB's disadvantaged business enterprise policy, it's a goal. It's a goal. It's not a mandate. So these businesses, if they show what they construe to be good faith efforts, unfortunately they've been given a pass. Same kind of thing with the city. And then it becomes critically important when a contract, when an RFP, RFQ goes out and there's a DBE component to it, if in fact that competing corporation, company, firm does not even countenance the DBE component, they're allowed to get information on how they can partner later. And in fact, both the city and the school system have done contracts where the DBE piece wasn't addressed until after the contract was given. The most recent superintendent replacement search firm experience with which I had direct experience was one of those examples.
It's a point that you kind of brought up earlier as you were addressing the first question, where you talked a little bit about how Justice and Beyond came into being. But I really would like for you to kind of go back to this point and I guess maybe really bring it home for our listeners and our viewers, helping us to understand why, because it's not just an economic thing, it's not just about businesses or jobs or money, why this is so important for the community, why this is something that everyone should be concerned about in our city, whether or not disadvantaged businesses, those businesses that are owned by minority interests, are getting their fair share. What does this mean for the average citizen, the average New Orleanian, how it affects us on a day-to-day basis?
And that's an excellent question. Just because of my personal history, I've been in and out of Atlanta for maybe 3 decades or more than 3 decades. And the interesting piece is, I remember going to the Atlanta airport when you could drive up to the front door, kind of like in a horseshoe fashion, put your luggage on the sidewalk there, drive around and park directly in front of the airport. I remember that. But then I remember when Maynard Jackson, Andy Young, and all those others began to say, look, we're not a port city, but we're going to act like that. And what we're going to do is create wealth. We're not going to be anti-white, anti-Asian, anti-Latino, Spanish, but we're going to be pro-black. So whoever gets a contract, we're going to make sure that black folk have an opportunity to get their piece of the pie. As you may or may not know, back in the days of affirmative action, when affirmative action had come forth, the main beneficiaries of affirmative action were white women. Even though you said women and minority, but it turned out to be white women. And in the DBE sphere, it seems to be a similar thing. But the Atlanta model, and I must say, that in the mayor's administration, there are people who are familiar with the Atlanta model who know about it because they spoke it to me when I asked about it. I don't know what the mayor's position personally is on it. I know that there are folk in there that countenance and that they have some respect for it. But when those individuals said, look, there are tremendous opportunities to increase wealth, but we have to have a fair and equitable distribution of that wealth. And the people who are most disadvantaged on the bottom of the rung are African-American businesses who are competent and qualified. And let me drag over some of the rhetoric from the affirmative action days. Many people were talking about, well, you just want to give somebody black some shit. No, 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 no. Affirmative action and disadvantaged business enterprise share this. You must be qualified. You must be competent. And furthermore, you must be certified to handle that work. This is no free lunch. This is something where people who have been systematically denied, shut out, and marginalized now have a chance to get a leg up. So DBEs are important to go to the front of the race. And here's the other piece. If you have a city that's majority black and your populace, your working population is majority black, then does it not make sense? The work should go to those individuals who comprise the majority of the populace. I mean, those are just demographics. But unfortunately, as we saw in the recovery of New Orleans, the people affected the least got the most. And they got it the quickest. Those who were most adversely and dramatically and severely affected got the least, and they got it last, if they got it at all. So it's only right and it's only fair to look at New Orleans, look at the history of craftspersons in this city, going all the way back to quote-unquote slavery era. The artisans, the ironwork in the quarters, the woodwork, the masons, all those individuals, those were black folk, people of color, and that has not stopped. So some of the best built things in this city were built by black folk, most lasting. Even the plantations that sit in a very, very moisture-laden environment were put together by the superior knowledge of West Africans who understood how to build buildings on the banks of a river and not have to deal with wood rot. That's just a piece of it. But if you go to the other extreme and go out to NASA, go out to Michoud, every space rocket that has gone into outer space has had something to do with that facility out there. And what a lot of people don't know, many of those engineers have done those groundbreaking, breakthrough kinds of innovations have been people of color, and they work out there. So the gamut, the whole range of the gamut screams, utilize the talent that you have, the people that you have, and then you will see the ripple effect. I remember back in the days of quote-unquote Reaganomics, there was supposed to be a trickle-down effect. Well, trickle-down don't work. Ripple does. So that if in fact, and I don't mean those on the street, but ripple works if you give people jobs. And I'm not talking about just teaching people how to fish. We already know how to fish. We're not looking for sardines or anchovies. We give the people a chance who have the skill set, who've been had the skill set. Some of that stuff is generational. Electricians passing down from generation to generation. Builders, individuals who can build a whole house from the ground up. We have a multiplicity of those. And then, now we even got the high-tech folk who can do this. This becomes important because, yes, a rising tide lifts all ships. But if you take my ship and tie it to the dock on a short string, I'm going to get sunk.
One of the things you just talked about, and you mentioned in there, and if you could expound on it a little bit, it's something that particularly concerns me as I listen to some of the back and forth as it relates to DBEs. Is this notion that the best person for the job, or you know, getting the most quality work is supersedes the need to include, to ensure that DBEs are included. And what I call it is this fallacy that that those two things are mutually exclusive, that having the best possible work done and having DBE involvement in that project, that those two things cannot exist. And I think you were talking about that a little bit, but if you could just kind of expound on that for our listeners.
Now, I think you're right. Three things come immediately to mind. The first piece is I was educated at Howard University in Washington, D.C. And the interesting thing about Howard is I came in contact, Greenbelt, Maryland, anybody, Ford Foundation, Ford Motor Company, I came in contact with the best folk in the world who happened to be black. Not the best black, but the best folk in the world. I can tell you now, my major was mathematics, and I can tell you from the standpoint of complex variables and differential equations, how a car engine cools the motor by the water running through with vector calculus. I learned that from J. Ernest Wilkins, who was on loan to Howard from the Ford Motor Company. The best on the planet, in many instances, are black. That's what I'm used to. That's what I got used to seeing in D.C. So I'm very much aware that you may not know who the best are because you have systematically excluded a whole community of people. One of the things that seem to be the case, if you've got multi-generations, and I don't mean that nepotism is evil, but if you've got multi-generations of nepotism where you have kept the best jobs for your friends and your family and never allowed anybody else to get in, or deliberately sabotaged it by getting mediocre or so-so folk, and then pointing to it, see, I told you it wouldn't work, then yes, you're going to be able to say, yeah, well, we have the best. But we know better than that. We know folk who can build all of the buildings that need to be built here, that can build any kind of appliance, any kind of industry that needs to be done. We know that we can do it. And guess what? Unfortunately, some of the best and our brightest are part of the prison industrial complex. And that goes back to a time when black men were snatched off the street and slavery by another name, as a book pointed out to us, that this country has benefited from another kind of slave labor of using black folk who, interestingly, are able to do all of the things they say they can't find for free black folk. So that's another issue. And then finally, the third piece was, if in fact you're saying you want to get the best back, make the process completely transparent. All these backroom deals and all this stuff. Let me call this person up. How is it that somebody else knows that another bid is going to come in at a certain level and that they need to make their adjustment, and they adjust it? You're supposed to be closed bid kind of
help our listeners keep some track of what's happening in the community as it relates to projects and contracts that we should be aware of?
The first thing, one of the things that I'm grateful for in my education at an HBCU was I learned how to ask questions. One of the questions that I think everybody should be asking is of the RSD, the Recovery School District. There seems to be about $350 million that folk can't account for. Why is that? How is that? Who has a responsibility for that? And how is it that contractors can be allowed to submit low bids and then make all of their money in change orders? And that's done consistently. So that needs to be raised. With Orleans Parish schools, with the school board, I think that, again, it's the same thing. If you have a goal and it is 35, 38%, what do you have in place to enforce that, to ensure that that happens? And with your contract process, with your contract letting process, are you requiring the DBE connect and identifying and proving that you have that connect on the front end? Same thing goes with the city. The city now has an office, and the city council passed, I think 7-0, an overwhelming majority, that they would have a very strong DBE process. But let's look at the World Trade Center. It does not seem that it has held up in that situation. The Times-Picayune, I'm not sure, maybe even the Advocate are asking questions. So how is it that you can hire a firm that says, let's get on with this stuff. We're not worried about this DBE stuff. That's not the important thing. The important thing is the numbers. The community can say, do you say what you mean, and do you mean what you say? If you said DBE and you meant it, how are you cementing that into the process? Not so that people have the option of opting in, opting out. Well, I'm going after that, and let me see, I'm going to advertise in the Canal Street corner paper. If you'd like to work with us, here we are. Or when the pressure comes on these firms, then all of a sudden now they're holding these little seminars and inviting people to come and say, well, where was that on the front end? That's something. The populace, the city can just keep raising questions, not to be cantankerous, not to be contrary, but to ask the kinds of questions that evidence analytical thinking.
As a community leader, as a man of faith, talk to me a little bit about the direct connection that I believe there is between some of the social problems that our community faces, poverty, crime, and opportunities that are available, and how DBEs can be a positive factor in that. I mean, one statistic that comes to my mind is that the employees at black-owned firms, 66% of all employees at black-owned firms are African Americans. So when we have and that's a national average, when we have the businesses, we overwhelmingly employ people that look like us, and what that could mean for a community like New Orleans that's dealing with unemployment among black men that's 50%, that's dealing with the crime issues that we're dealing with. If DBEs were allowed to have the opportunities to have a piece of the economic growth that's taking place in the city.
Now, allow me to mix a metaphor. You threw the ball from the pitcher's mound to me, and it looked like it was a straight, I don't know, fastball here. But it's a curve. Now let me hit this curve. The interesting thing in the history of civil rights, there was a coalition built among African American leaders, black leaders, labor unions, and the Jewish community. My contention is the reason that is particularly with the Jewish community, part of the historic heritage of that community is that they stand on issues of justice and righteousness, of righteousness and justice. Those kinds of things that are moral and ethical issues. If you look in the history of the interaction of people in the life story of the Hebrew, Jewish, Israelite community, you will find that those things that were most unrighteous, that were most unjust, had to do with unfair business practices, had to do with depriving people of justice, had to do with the systematic abuse of people. And the 7th and 8th century prophets, those among which Martin Luther King Jr. and others quoted, "Let justice roll down like rivers and righteousness as a never-flowing stream," they cried against those practices where the poor were marginalized, were trampled on, they were eaten up. And so I think the common cause that the African American community had with the Jewish community was that there was a common heritage of mishpat and tzedakah, that this justice and righteousness we had in common. This country also has helped to create a middle class with the work of the labor unions. Had it not been for the labor unions, many poor folk from the deep South who made their way to Detroit, Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, and worked in the factories would not have been able to enjoy that kind of middle class life. And those unions, some of which, yes, they did discriminate, but that opportunity kind of lifted a lot of folks. So those common causes those are the foundations of my faith. That's what I understand. And every Monday at 4:45, we meet at 1700 Conti Christian Unity Baptist Church. And I lay into Baptist because a lot of people leave Baptists out. They think only progressive people are folk who don't have a denomination. Yeah, we're Baptists, and it just so happens that our convention is Progressive National Baptist Convention as well as the American Baptist. But we've also moved those meetings around. We've held them at Utno's headquarters in Gentilly. We've held them on Love Outreach on Opelousas on the West Bank. But the place that seems to be most convenient to people consistently is to come to Christian Unity Baptist Church. So every Monday at 4:45, we realize that some people are coming straight from work, and so we have a little repast. You know, generally have some red beans and rice, some white beans, some chicken, some vegetables. Those who are vegetarians, we make accommodations for that. But the notion is we understand that if you're going to sacrifice to come for a meeting like this, then we need to minister to your physical body. And that's just a small example of what we try to model on a macro scale.
And anything I haven't asked regarding anything we've talked about that you think is important?
We are a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-generational table. I'll use an old term, on a black tip. You know, we are unabashedly black, and we don't apologize for that. And I think that's the draw. I think that's what makes it multiracial. That's what makes it multi-ethnic. That's what makes it intergenerational, because we are who we are, and we're not ashamed. So we're not ashamed of who we are, and we're not ashamed of having concern, seeking the welfare of the city, where we may be exiled, but we believe that there is a God, and God is concerned, and that God is on the side of the oppressed. But we have our part to play, and we must do what we can, work while it's day, because the night's coming when nobody's going to be able to work.
Thank you very much for your time.